The way certain games are represented on console systems versus computers always strikes that weird spark of curiosity within me. Sure, there's games which typically fared better on one than the other, but I feel the gap between those closed up during the late 1990s. But the results weren't always what you might have expected, particularly when it comes to simulation type games, which tended to fall afoul of the limited control options of the time, at least on the consoles. Which is why I guess I've developed a strong fondness for the Ace Combat games, because they've always managed to walk that fine line between giving you a slice of the combat flight sim experience, but keeping with the pace of arcade action. Something I feel is best shown with the fourth game, published by Namco in 2001 on the PlayStation 2. Before I dive in, like the other games in the PS2 trilogy, the titles of each differ between NTSC and PAL regions, so for the sake of my sanity, I'm just going to be referring to this as Ace Combat 4 or AC4 for the rest of this video. As the first game in the series to introduce the Strangereal setting, it brings a lot to the table in terms of its background, though thankfully that's not something that's going to overwhelm those who are new to the series. It's also the game which, to me, defines the way the story gets presented with the Ace Combat games, but we'll talk more on that later. You don the flight suit of the pilot, call sign Mobius 1, who goes from a random pilot in the ISAF forces to single-handedly turning the tide in the Continental War against the Erusians. The story of his role in the conflict is delivered through updates in mission briefings, alongside events as they play out during combat missions. I'm a big fan of the mission structure here in Ace Combat 4. Sure, it eschews the factions and whatnot which were present in the Japanese version of its predecessor, and you don't get the branching mission paths that you'll see in later games in the series. Now, I've got no issue with this at all, as it gives you that sense of straightforward progress you get in those more arcade-style experiences. Now that, of course, harkens back to the roots of Ace Combat, being an expansion of Namco's Air Combat arcade machines. Oddly enough, why it carried that name in, well, at least the first game carried that name in the West. Each mission here is introduced with a briefing, bringing the atmosphere into play thanks to the combination of tense background music and the voice-delivered briefings. They may not offer the detail you'd expect from a military simulation, but Ace Combat isn't a simulation, so you don't have to memorize specific targets or waypoints or things like that. Before you can get into the skies, you'll have to choose which plane you'll want to fly and which of its special weapons you want to carry. Now, you feel this might betray the arcade roots of the game, but again, I think it strikes a nice balance between realism and aesthetics. You see, Ace Combat 4 offers you 20 flyable aircraft. The majority of these are real-life fighters, ones you probably know if you've got an interest in flight sims or things like that. Whether it's simple older craft like the F4 which you start with, or modern fare like the Eurofighter or F-22. There are a few fictionalized variants of some of these planes, which gives you a different priority in mission choice once you get down the line. Each plane fits one of three profiles. Fighters are focused on air-to-air engagements, with attackers being suited towards taking on ground targets. Multi-role aircraft are the in-betweeners, which can handle both air-to-air and air-to-ground engagements, but aren't specifically optimized for either one, like the fighters or attackers are. It's not easy to strike a balance, but for me this does actually set that balance. If you know of these planes in real life, you'll know their uses, and it gives you an idea of what you might want to bring along, and what should be the best choice for each mission. Though, if you're not entirely familiar with that side of things, the descriptions presented for each plane give you a bit of a pointer into what it's best suited for. In general, aircraft selection I find is a neat way to balance the overall progression here, as completing missions will slowly make new aircraft available for you to choose. though you can't just hop into them when they become available, you have to buy them. So yeah, we'll touch on that in a bit too. When it comes to the missions themselves, all of them are typically set against the clock. You'll have to complete your objectives before time runs out, and submissions will have extra time added as you complete objectives based on things progressing in them, so you do have to be careful for that. I find this is a great way to just keep the pressure on you as a player, but not get you stuck, like taking forever trying to complete a mission. They're all a reasonable time to play through now. I think the longest might be 20 odd minutes, so you're not completely stuck if things go wrong. And of course you can restart in the middle should you mess up. The focus on them is typically taking out a small group of targets, usually in the form of aircraft, like the interception mission that you start off with, or ground targets like a strike on a solar power facility several missions in. So success really comes from getting in there, taking out those desired targets quickly, and surviving, getting it all done before time runs out. There are a number of general purpose strike missions, and these will put you in a theatre with a large number of targets to take out, and the goal is to destroy enough of them to reach a certain target score. Again, these have a larger scenario area to fly in, and they also introduce the ability to return to base. There's a designated return line. If you cross that line, you'll return to base and you'll get a chance to re-arm and change your loadout if necessary. Not only that, you also get the chance to handle the landing and takeoff in these, and I absolutely adore this. Maybe it's that long-term combat flight sim fan of me, but always starting the mission in the air and not having to actually end a mission on the ground does make me miss that experience. So being able to do that on a rearm feels really fancy. And of course, if you're not entirely comfortable with handling the landing or the takeoff, you can skip them, which is also handy if you want to save a little time, especially longer missions. If you've done this multiple times, you just want to get back into the fray of it. I understand that that's there, and I love that it is, but I tend to enjoy actually coming in for that landing and then taking off again. It just feels right. When in combat though, things handle incredibly well. You may not have the precise flight models that these aircrafts would have if playing a proper simulator, but you've got a great sensation of flight nonetheless. You could stall the plane if you fly too slow, and you can perform plenty of tricks to avoid being locked on by enemies. And plus, you've got the means for some precise controls as you push your fight up to the limits. And all of this happens to fit pretty well on the PlayStation 2's DualShock controller. You've got analog controls for your plane's nose, but support for the pressure-sensitive buttons for controlling your throttle or viewing the radar map. Now, I'll admit this is probably because I've played later games in the series first on systems where there aren't pressure-sensitive buttons, but I do find them a bit of a gimmick, especially with the radar view, because you've got to keep applying pressure precisely to get it to zoom out, and you'll see this in some of the footage, but you'll see the radar wobble a bit because it's like, I'm not pressing it down enough, but I'm not, and it's not quite at the right threshold to move to the next stage. I much prefer just being able to tap it to cycle through there. But who knows, maybe it's just the result of playing with 20-something-year-old gamepads. And back in 2001 when this game shipped, these controllers were new, far more responsive, and probably a lot more precise on the electronic side of things. Now, tying in with the progression of additional aircraft is the weapon systems. Now, each aircraft has 3 weapons available. 2 of them are fixed. The first being your cannon, which is for close-range encounters, whether against planes or ground targets. You do need plenty of precise targeting and leading for your shots to land here, so it's definitely something that you're going to need to practice to take real advantage of it during a mission. Secondly are your stock missiles. These are simple lock-on and fire missiles. Thankfully, it's a pretty quick process to lock on, and you've got a large supply of them, again assuring realism here, and it But you can easily waste them if you're not careful, especially if you're going after air targets. You've really got to get behind an enemy to use them properly. Now, each aircraft carries a third slot, which is for a special weapon, and this tends to be aligned with their general purpose, fighter, multi-role, or attacker. The special weapons tend to be aligned to those purposes. And it's really the fun of the game here is because you get things like unguided bombs for those ground targets to long-range anti-air or anti-ground missiles, and even some fancier missiles which can handle multiple targets at once, so you can fire a salvo burst against several targets. Each plane will have 2 or 3 to unlock. One of them will be unlocked when you buy the plane, and you'll have to buy the other ones as necessary. And to do that, well, that's where your rewards come into play. Because once you complete a mission, you get a play-by-play summary of what happens. It shows you taking down all the targets, tabulating what you've gotten, what points you get, and also how much you earn for this. If you score well enough in a mission, you'll also get bonuses for reaching higher scoring grades. And this, of course, all lets you buy new aircraft or weapons between missions. So you have access to a shop, and here you can buy or sell aircraft or their weapons. Now, at this point, you know what you're going into for the mission. You've seen the briefing and you can replay the briefing. But here you can, pick what you need based on what's coming up ahead. And sometimes you might need to sell off a plane or weapons in order to fund one you think might be better. Because this is a linear graph, like if you have a fighter earlier in the list, a fighter later in the list is typically better. Same with attackers, same with multi-role. So as you go through the game, you'll want to upgrade. But of course, you don't have to. You can limit yourself to a weaker aircraft if it's a personal favourite. It just gives you a bit of extra challenge as necessary. Now we've got the story as developed through the combat, through briefings, through events that occur during missions. But after most missions, you'll get a peek into the second track of the story here. There is the story being recalled by the wartime experience from someone who was there, who was a kid, orphaned, and spent time with the enemy squadron, the Yellow Squadron, who is sort of your nemesis in the game. These sequences presented, they're mainly still images with a voiceover narrating these things, go quite some way to showing off the opposite side of the conflict here. The experiences of being in occupied territory and how things are managed there in the kind of oppressive environment, to showing that the enemy might not be the monsters you think they are. They're there for their own, things. They might just be there because it's a job. They're not really there. And it's not a deep dive into these themes, but it's the core of the anti-war themes that you see particularly get defined in later games in the series. They're touched on here, and you can't help but feel a little tinge of sadness at how things play out, especially once you get to the end of the game. It's not a case where you're going to be thinking, wow, cool airplane, as a result of what you see in-game. There is this sort of reflection on the nature of warfare. And all of this, of course, is brought together with what I feel is quite a striking visual style. Not just from these intermission story updates, but you've got the in-game HUD, the briefing systems, and the general art style of the aircraft and terrain. Everything is appropriately defined and nothing really clashes, but more importantly, it's that the game runs in a tight, fluid frame rate, and with little or no apparent slowdown. At least that's what I felt playing it. Granted, I am playing the PAL version, but it seems rock solid, and I think that's ever so important for the overall experience. Everything responds properly, which means those moments where you hit the deck and crash out, or you miss time avoiding a missile and get shot down, it's all on you, not on the game. And that's just as it should be. To go off that, of course, is that the enemy AI will give you plenty of challenge. Getting into that right position to unload your missiles or try to get a few shots with the gun is quite important, especially should you be dealing with some of the more dangerous threats, like the aforementioned Yellow Squadron. In fact, I love the way the game develops this sort of growing skill of Mobius 1 in relation to them. When you first encounter them, they are a nigh indefeatable threat. Your only option is just to cut and return to base and just survive. but the subsequent encounters with him throughout the game slowly even up the odds. First, you manage to hit one and damage them. Then it's a case of actually downing one. And finally, when you face him in the final mission, it's time to end it once and for all, and you can't complete that mission without downing all of them. Like I said, it really reflects on the journey of Mobius 1 as a pilot, becoming more and more skilled and more feared based on how you as a player progress through the game. It corresponds to your own experience as a player. You know, you start out playing this game and even if you know other flight games, you don't really know the nuances here in Ace Combat 4. Yet, as you go through, you slowly develop them. You slowly get better at them, and you become way more effective out in the field. Of course, the one last little bit I think I've got to touch on is, of course, one of the most important, and that is the soundtrack. Namco's team went all out here. Not only does each mission carry its own theme, but the way they contribute to the story and the atmosphere is incredible. It's one of those subtle things, but one example of this is as the game progresses and the nature of the war begins to change, you know, you're doing less defensive missions and actually carrying out strikes, is the briefing theme changes from being this sort of tense, darker piece to something that's a little more like, it's still a tense piece, but it's sort of at a higher key of like, yeah, we're accomplishing things. And it's interesting the way it keeps you feeling pumped as you move into this later phase of the game. But of course, there's many other elements where similar thing kind of happens with the soundtrack in general. And of course, we can't touch on the fact that during the final mission, where there is some serious stakes involved, well, there's no briefing theme at all. And of course, when things do carry out at the end of it, well, it all feels incredibly well earned. All of this is why Ace Combat 4 really sits so well in my heart. I can't think of many air combat games which nail the feeling of being Ace, of being the hero and feeling in total command of a fighter and putting a stop to a vicious war. It's not even a feeling I've gotten from the earlier games in the series. You just sort of go out there and do your job with those. So perhaps it's just the extra smoothness, or the soundtrack, or just everything coming together. Regardless though, every playthrough of Ace Combat 4 for me has left me feeling content and challenged by the end. It's one of those games where I feel I have a great time with it, and feel I've had my fill when I reach the end, yet I want to come back for more eventually. It's the kind of replayability that I miss with modern games. Many of them expect you to make every game your forever game, instead of being able to treat it like a book or movie or TV show. You can enjoy it and put it down. Return to it sometime later when you've got an itch to experience it all again. And it's kind of the perfect place to wrap this one up. I totally wish Ace Combat 4 and its PS2 siblings would get a reissue and be available in this modern era, but I think they're reasonably priced on the secondary market, so if you do have a PS2 still knocking around, they're not too painful to get a hold of. Though as always, I hope it's given you the itch to take to the shattered skies to make like distant thunder. And if you've enjoyed the episode, then consider the usual things to help me out and keep the show going. It's a great way to show support, especially for smaller independent channels that don't have that groundswell of popularity. But there's not much more for me to say than to just say thank you all very much for watching.